They built part of their million-dollar house on top of my septic system, and for a while, they thought money would make that problem disappear. It didn't. In fact, it made things worse in a way they never saw coming, and by the time they realized it, there was no fixing it without tearing apart the one thing they loved most about that house. I've lived on the same piece of land since the late 90s, about 8 acres tucked away at the end of a narrow dirt road outside a small town most people only pass through on their way somewhere else. Back then, it was just woods, quiet and untouched, the kind of place where you hear wind in the trees more often than cars, and at night it gets so dark you can see every star like someone spilled salt across the sky. I built my cabin myself in 1998, nothing fancy, just solid, practical, and mine, every beam, every nail, every mistake along the way. And when I put in the septic system, I did it by the book, county permit, inspections, surveys, the whole deal. It wasn't cheap, but it worked, and for over 20 years, it worked perfectly. For most of that time, nothing really changed out there. A few neighbors miles apart, the occasional hunter passing through, maybe a new mailbox popping up down the road every couple years, but mostly it stayed the same, which is exactly why I loved it. You don't buy land like that because it's convenient. You buy it because it's yours, because nobody bothers you, because the silence feels earned. Then about 3 years ago, the silence broke. At first it was just the sound of machines in the distance, chainsaws, trucks, that low constant hum that doesn't belong in the woods. I remember standing out by my fence line one morning with a cup of coffee, listening to it echo through the trees, thinking, well, guess that was only a matter of time. Turns out a development company had bought up a big stretch of forest right behind my property. They called it Cedar Hollow Estates, which I guess sounded better on a brochure than used to be woods. Within months, the trees were gone. In their place came wide dirt roads, heavy equipment, and eventually these massive houses started going up, all of them big, polished, and just slightly different enough to pretend they weren't copies of each other. 5 bedrooms, 3-car garages, beige siding in 10 different shades like someone couldn't commit to one color. Perfect lawns, young trees planted in straight lines, everything neat in a way that didn't feel natural. I didn't like it, but I also didn't say anything. It wasn't my land. People build what they want on what they own, and I've always believed in that. So I kept to myself, fixed what needed fixing around the cabin, went about my days the same way I always had. The only real change was the noise, and the feeling that I wasn't as alone out there anymore. Then the McAllisters moved in. Now, most of the folks who bought houses in that development were exactly what you'd expect. Families, retirees, people looking for quiet, but still wanting something modern. The McAllisters were different. Daniel and Rebecca McAllister, both corporate attorneys out of the city, the kind of people who don't just want a house, they want the biggest version of it. They paid extra for a custom build, bigger footprint, upgraded everything, and the centerpiece, this huge glass sunroom off the back of the house, designed specifically to capture the natural woodland view. Which, as it turned out, meant my backyard. I noticed the construction early on because their lot backed right up against mine. At first it was just grading and clearing, nothing unusual, but then one afternoon I walked down to the edge of my property and something didn't sit right. I'd had my land surveyed 3 separate times over the years, once when I bought it, once when I installed the septic system, and once more about 10 years later just to be sure everything lined up. I knew exactly where my boundary markers were supposed to be, and what I saw didn't match. The orange survey stakes they were using didn't line up with mine. Not even close. I stood there for a while, just looking, trying to convince myself I was mistaken. Maybe they were marking something temporary. Maybe I was remembering wrong. But the more I checked, the clearer it became. Their foundation lines were pushed at least 15 feet past where my property ended. And not just anywhere. Right over my septic drain field. Now, if you don't know much about septic systems, the drain field is basically where everything filters out into the soil. It's not something you build over, not if you want it to keep working. Heavy weight, like a house foundation, can crush the pipes, compact the soil, and once that happens, you're looking at a full system failure. Expensive doesn't even begin to cover it. So I walked over to the site, found the foreman, and tried to handle it the simple way. "Hey," I said, holding out a copy of my survey map. "I think there's been a mistake. Your foundation's crossing onto my land." He looked at the paper, then at me, then back at the paper like he was hoping it would explain itself. You sure about that? I'm positive, I said. I've got markers back there. This line right here? That's mine. You're about 15 feet over. He frowned, scratched the back of his neck, and pulled out his phone. Let me call my supervisor. About 20 minutes later, a guy named Victor Hale showed up. Clean boots, crisp shirt, brand new hard hat like it had never seen dirt. The kind of guy who looked more comfortable in an office than on a construction site. He walked up, gave me a quick once-over, and said, "You're the homeowner?" "That's right." I handed him the survey. He glanced at it, barely more than a second, then handed it back. "Our records show this entire section belongs to the McAllister lot." I felt my jaw tighten a little. "Your records are wrong." He gave a small smile, not friendly, more like polite dismissal. "We work with certified surveyors. Everything's been verified." "So have mine," I said. 3 times. "You're building on my septic field." That got a slight pause, but not enough. "We're on a tight schedule," he said, like that settled it. "If you have concerns, you can take it up through proper channels." Proper channels. That's the phrase people use when they don't plan on stopping. I stood there a moment longer, realizing this wasn't going to be a quick fix, and that was the moment it shifted from a misunderstanding into a problem. So I did what most people would do at that point. I tried to handle it directly before things got ugly. I went back to the cabin, dug out my paperwork, triple-checked every survey I had, walked the property line again just to be absolutely certain I wasn't the one making a mistake, and I wasn't. Not even close. They were deep into my land, and worse than that, they were sitting right on top of the most critical part of my septic system. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was angry, not yet anyway. It was more this slow, creeping frustration, like watching a train wreck happen in slow motion while everyone around you insists the tracks are clear. I kept thinking, maybe they'll realize it on their own. Maybe someone higher up will catch it before it goes too far. They didn't. By the next morning, they were pouring concrete. I drove back down there, this time not just with papers, but with stakes and bright tape, marking what I knew was the true boundary line. I wasn't trying to start a fight, just making it impossible to ignore. Workers were moving around, rebar in place, forms set, and right there, clear as day, the foundation trench cutting straight across my drain field. I found Victor again. "You need to stop this," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Right now? Once that concrete goes in, you're not fixing this without tearing it all out." He barely looked up from his clipboard. "We're proceeding as planned. You're building on my land. Our survey disagrees." I let out a slow breath, trying not to let it turn into something else. "Then call your surveyor. Call the county. Hell, call whoever you need to call, but don't pour that foundation until this is sorted." That's when he finally looked at me. Really looked this time, like I'd become more of an inconvenience than a person. "We're not halting a project of this scale over a dispute like this," he said. "If you believe there's an issue, you're welcome to pursue legal action." There it was again, that phrase, dressed up a little different this time, but meaning the same thing. We're not stopping. So I went one step higher. I got the number for the homeowners, Daniel and Rebecca McAllister. Took a bit of asking around, but people in new developments like that tend to talk. I called that afternoon, standing out on my porch, looking toward the construction site like maybe that would help me stay calm. She answered. "Hello. Hi, this is Thomas Reed," I said. "I own the property directly behind yours. I believe there's been a serious mistake with your build." There was a pause, then a soft exhale, like I'd already tired her out. "What kind of mistake?" "Your foundation is over my property line," I said. "About 15 feet. It's sitting on my septic drain field. I've already spoken to your contractor, but they're continuing anyway." Another pause, longer this time. "Well," she said finally, her tone shifting into something colder, more practiced. "Our developer conducted a full survey before construction began. I'm confident everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. I've had 3 independent surveys done over the years," I replied. "All of them match. I can show you." "I'm sure your cabin survey is very thorough," she interrupted, with just enough emphasis to make it clear what she thought of it. "But we've invested a significant amount into this property. We're not going to halt construction based on conflicting paperwork." "It's not conflicting," I said, feeling that frustration start to edge into something sharper. "It's wrong. And if you keep building, you're going to cause permanent damage." There was a faint laugh on the other end, quiet but unmistakable. "If there is any inconvenience caused," she said, I'm sure we can reach a financial arrangement. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, just to make sure I'd heard that right. This isn't about inconvenience, I said, slower now. You're on my land. I'm asking you to stop and fix it before it gets worse. And I'm telling you, she replied, her voice tightening, that our legal team has reviewed everything. We're within our rights. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a decision. So I gave her one. You have 1 week, I said. Stop construction, verify the boundary, and move the foundation. After that, I file in court. Silence. Then, just barely, she laughed again. Do what you feel is necessary, Mr. Reed. Our attorneys are very good. Click. That was it. No compromise, no second look, no hesitation, just confidence backed by money and the assumption that it would be enough. And for a while it was. They kept building. Foundation poured, framing went up, walls closed in, roof finished, and every step of the way, that structure sat heavier and heavier on top of my drain field. I filed for an injunction almost immediately, but anyone who's dealt with the legal system knows how that goes. Motions, delays, responses, continuances, their lawyers stretched every part of it as long as they could. Weeks turned into months. By the time we finally got in front of a judge, their house was done. Not just done, landscaped, furnished, lived in. Lights on at night, cars in the driveway, that big glass sunroom glowing like a showroom display, pointed straight out at the woods and at my land. At my problem. The courtroom itself was quiet, almost too quiet for something that had built up this much tension. I sat there with my attorney, a local guy named Harris who didn't talk much but knew his stuff, while across the room the McAllisters sat with their legal team, polished and composed like this was just another case on their schedule. When it was my turn, we laid everything out. The surveys, the permits, the inspection records, all of it. Clear, consistent, undeniable. Harris didn't overcomplicate it, just walked the judge through the timeline, the boundary, the encroachment. 15 feet. Then their side went. Different survey, different interpretation, a lot of language about reasonable reliance and development standards. It sounded good if you didn't know what you were looking at, but it didn't change the facts. And the judge saw that. He took his time, flipping through documents, comparing maps, asking a few pointed questions, then finally set everything down and looked up. The boundary line is clear, he said. The structure encroaches approximately 15 feet onto the plaintiff's property. You could feel the shift in the room right there. Rebecca straightened in her seat. Daniel leaned forward, like he was about to say something but thought better of it. The judge continued, calm and direct. The remedy is straightforward. The encroaching portion of the structure must be removed. Not compensated. Not negotiated. Removed. Rebecca was on her feet before he even finished. You can't be serious, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the room. Do you have any idea what we've invested in that property? The judge didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. You should have verified your boundary before building. Simple as that. No sympathy, no wiggle room, just the consequence of a choice they'd made months earlier. And for the first time since this all started, I saw something crack. Not the house. Not yet. But the certainty behind it. For a few days after that ruling, things went quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, more like the air right before a storm. No construction crews, no trucks, no movement around that sunroom that had been the centerpiece of their whole place. I figured they were regrouping, talking to lawyers, trying to find some angle to get out of it, and honestly, part of me thought they might. People with that kind of money don't usually hit a wall without trying to buy a door through it. But while they were figuring out their next move, something else started happening. At first, it was subtle. A smell. Now, if you've lived with a septic system long enough, you know what normal smells like. Or more accurately, what it doesn't. This wasn't normal. It was faint at the start, just enough to make you stop and wonder if something was off, like catching a whiff of something you can't quite place. I noticed it one morning while I was out near the back fence, coffee in hand, looking toward their house. I remember thinking, no, that can't be it. But over the next couple days, it got stronger. Then the ground started to change. Right near the edge of my property, where the drain field ran underneath, the soil looked darker, wetter than it should have been. Not muddy from rain, not surface water, something else. I walked out there, crouched down, and just stared at it for a minute, already knowing what I was going to find before I even touched it. When I did, yeah, warm. Saturated. Wrong. I stood up slow, wiped my hands on my jeans, and just let out this long breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Because right then, it all connected, the weight of that foundation, sitting directly on top of the pipes, compressing everything underneath, nowhere for the system to drain. They hadn't just crossed a line. They'd broken something that couldn't be ignored anymore. I called a septic specialist that same day, a guy named Ron who'd been working systems around the county longer than I'd owned the place. He showed up the next morning in an old pickup that looked like it had seen everything twice, took one walk out to the field, and didn't even bother pretending it might be minor. Well, he said, hands on his hips, looking toward the McAllister house. That's about as bad as it gets. How bad? I asked. He gave a short laugh, not amused. Whole drain field shot. Pipes are crushed, soil's compacted. There's nowhere for anything to go. It's backing up. I glanced toward that sunroom. All glass and clean lines, sunlight reflecting off it like nothing in the world was wrong. Can it be fixed? Oh yeah, he said. You can fix anything. Pause. But not without tearing up everything above it. There it was. Not a maybe. Not a warning. A fact. I had him put it all in writing. Full inspection report, photos, everything documented clean and clear. Then I took it straight back to my attorney. This qualifies as an environmental hazard, Harris said after reading through it. We can push for emergency authorization to repair. How fast? I asked. Faster than they can delay it. And for the first time since this started, the timeline shifted. The court approved the emergency work almost immediately. Sewage backup tends to get attention in a way property lines alone don't. Health risk, contamination, all the things you can't ignore or stall out with paperwork. Which meant I had legal clearance to fix my system. Exactly where it was. Under their sunroom. When the notice hit them, they reacted fast. Faster than they had at any point before. I got a call that evening. Daniel this time, not Rebecca. Thomas, he said, voice tight but controlled. We need to talk about this repair plan. I've already got a plan, I said. It's approved. You understand that excavation in that area could compromise the structural integrity of our home. I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window toward the tree line. That's what your engineer's going to say in court, right? A pause. You've seen the report. I've seen mine too, I said. System's destroyed. Needs to be replaced. We're willing to discuss alternatives, he said quickly, like he'd rehearsed it. Relocation, compensation, whatever it takes to avoid fixing the problem where you caused it. I cut in. Another pause, longer this time. You're asking us to absorb catastrophic loss, he said. I couldn't help it. I let out a small laugh. Not loud, not cruel, just tired. No, I said. I'm fixing my septic system. The hearing on that motion was shorter than the first, but a lot more intense. Their engineer testified exactly like Daniel said he would, diagrams, load calculations, all of it pointing to one conclusion. If excavation happened under that sunroom, the foundation could fail. Collapse wasn't guaranteed, but it was a real risk. Their attorney leaned hard into that. Safety, liability, disproportionate damage. He made it sound like I was trying to bring the whole house down out of spite. Then Harris stood up. We're not asking to damage their structure, he said calmly. We're asking to repair essential infrastructure on our client's property. The obstruction is theirs. Simple, direct, hard to argue with. The judge listened, asked a few questions, flipped through the reports again, and then gave them the only option they had left. If the structure above the repair area presents a risk, he said, it must be removed prior to excavation. You have 30 days. 30 days. I looked over at the McAllisters when he said it. Rebecca didn't say anything this time. No outburst, no disbelief, just this tight, controlled expression like she was holding everything in place by force. Daniel leaned back slowly, staring straight ahead, like he was trying to calculate something that no longer had a solution. Because there wasn't one. Not anymore. Over the next few weeks, I watched it happen. Crews showed up again, different ones this time. Not building, dismantling. They started with the glass, panel by panel, that big sunroom coming apart piece by piece. It was strange, seeing something that had been designed to impress, to show off, being taken down so carefully, like even in failure they wanted it to look controlled. But there's no clean way to undo a mistake like that. By the time they got to the structural supports, it was obvious that whole section of the house had to go. Not the entire place, but enough that it changed everything about it. What used to be the highlight became the scar. Once it was clear, Ron came back with his crew. Excavators, trenching equipment, the works. They dug out the entire field, pipes crushed flat in some places, completely displaced in others. The soil was compacted so tight it barely drained at all. He shook his head more than once while they worked, like even after all his years, it still bothered him to see something done that wrong. We replaced everything. New lines, new field, full rebuild, done right, the way it should have been left in the first place. The final bill, between demolition, repairs, legal fees, environmental mitigation, it came out to just under $350,000. I never paid a cent of it. And the McAllisters, well, they paid in more ways than one. The house is still there, technically, but it's not the one they built, not the one they imagined. And that view they wanted so badly, the one that looked out over untouched woods, now it looks over a patch of ground that reminds them, every single day, exactly where they went wrong. Sometimes I sit out on my porch in the evening, same as I always have, watching the light fade through the trees, listening to the quiet come back a little at a time, and I think about how close this all came to going differently. If they just stopped, if they just listened, if they checked, but they didn't. And here's the part one still go back and forth on. Maybe you will too. Was it justice? Or was it just the natural consequence of people believing they were too big to be wrong? Because I didn't tear their house down. I didn't crush those pipes. I didn't ignore the boundary line. All I did was refuse to let it slide. So I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have taken the money and walked away? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you'd expect. And if you want more stories like this, real situations where property lines turn into something a whole lot bigger, go ahead and hit subscribe. Because this kind of thing, it happens more often than people think.